Hi everyone, my name is Nidhi Sachdeva and I am a PhD candidate at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto in Canada. Uh, I have also been an educator and teaching a wide repertoire of languages since 2004. So been very active in the classroom, and for the last 3 weeks I've been very engaged with this notion of microlearning, and I've decided to make that the focus of my PhD research. What specifically I'm doing in microlearning is it being a really popular word, a big trend, especially within the corporate learning and development industry. It hasn't really found its actual meaning, so to say, in the academia or in the academic sort of world. And I got superiorly intrigued by this idea. And so I wanted to understand what's the role that microlearning can play for the most part, specifically in the formal higher education. So that's really the area of my research right now. I'm combining it with cognitive science and cognitive psychology. And yeah, it's been a really exciting journey so far. So I have been doing a design-based research, and what I've done is I have chosen a very specific graduate online learning classroom. So I'm focusing right now on an online learning environment, and I ran 3 iterations of that study throughout the academic year. So starting from fall, winter, and what we call it the intersession or the first summer session. And I've done different ways of integrating microlearning, more organized ways of microlearning within this online learning environment for the students. And these are all graduate students. And what I've found is just early findings is students are enjoying it. Students are waiting for it to be presented to them. And this was very contrary to when I initially brought the idea that I want to study microlearning in academia, because there's this funny joke, and I often say is that if it's not complicated enough, then it's not academic enough. But I'm going against that flow. So what I'm finding is that students are enjoying when something is presented to them in a digestible sort of format, and we're calling it, of course, microlearning in this context. But then there's a lot more behind it. There's a lot more cognitive science behind it. I'm really focused on the human cognitive architecture, and that's a huge driving force for me. So you mentioned initial findings. So initial findings, definitely, I would say the student experience has been positive, but I'm of course still analyzing the data to understand further deeper layers of the themes and what really the actual stuff that I can take out of that data that I'm looking at, quantitative data and qualitative data. But initial findings, I would say, is that it's being received in a positive light. So yes, because I'm still looking at the data, but something that really did surprise me is this notion that outside of the academic world, we're using oftentimes microlearning as just in time, on the go mobile learning, which actually brought me to microlearning. I initially went to do my PhD program thinking I want to explore something in mobile learning and language learning because that's been really big focus. But of course, as you organically grow through the process of your courses and meeting the folks that you're working with, researchers, professors, but every time I research my mobile learning, it will drop me on to the notion of micro learning. And I needed to look at it. So I went in with not an assumption, I would say, but this idea that mobile would be a really picked up theme, but it is not. I have asked multiple times throughout the study my students, how are you accessing the micro lesson? And over again, they're accessing it on the desktop, although they are made in a way that they can actually access it anywhere. So it kind of makes me think there might be a bit different way of looking at it when it comes to formal higher education. I haven't been able to make that connection just yet, but I'm also still analyzing my data. But when I look at it first, I kind of wanted to see, not wanted to see, but more like I assumed, oh, maybe there'll be a lot of mobile devices when I look at the clicks, and it's often a desktop. So that's a bit of a surprising finding in a way, but also interesting at the same time. And I'm trying to understand that mobile learning and formal higher education, maybe there is a bit of a distance still, and something for me to further explore. So the way I see the difference between mobile learning and micro learning, mobile learning is such a vast theme, and it's any kind of learning, in my opinion, that's happening on a mobile device, and be it a tablet, be it a cell phone, and that's sort of how I, in a very, very, very wider way. Micro learning is more of the, I would say, an approach and the strategy, how you actually organize the learning content. So it's less about the device, but more about how you're organizing the content and how you're presenting that, how you're using the pedagogy behind it. So that's the biggest component for me. Now, it automatically happened as micro learning started to begin, sort of to take up. You could do it quickly, and of course, it's a great tool for reskilling, upskilling. New products are being developed constantly, new services, tourism industry, healthcare industry, doctors. There's a lot of new learning that needs to happen very fast, and so micro learning seems to be, or folks are going towards that direction. And cell phones are in every hand, so it kind of like made sense to make that bridge, that just in time learning, on the go learning. So I think that's where the two kind of got really connected with each other. So if you search on a Google device, just go search on Google and just look into mobile learning, somehow you'll fall on micro learning, which is exactly what happened to me about 3-4 years ago, which was still new, I would say, in this particular field. So this is how I would sort of differentiate the two. One is more about a device and sort of mobile device, and the other one is more about the content organization, pedagogy, and how you're going to actually organize your learning material. But when speaking with students, the sense I get is that when it comes to formal higher ed, students are serious. And it's not to say that cell phones are not a serious device, but their cell phones are their entertainment, escape from learning. They'll go on Instagram, the Reels, the TikTok, Facebook, etc. And I think when say, okay, I'm going to do schoolwork, university work, stakes are rather high. I don't want to miss something because there might be something on the quiz or an assignment or a paper. And it's natural tendency for them to go back to their device where they can see things a little bit more clear. And this is, again, the sense that I'm getting through all the interviews that I'm getting, right? The data tells me that they are accessing the micro lessons that I'm presenting for them on a desktop. But why is that? That's still like I'm trying to explore the reasons. But one of the reasons that's come up over and over again is that, well, I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure. And I think cell phone is their little escape from school, if you know what I mean. They may do emails, they may connect with folks, and they may connect with their professors and group folks that they're doing teamwork with, collaboration with, through WhatsApp, etc. But I think when it comes to learning, cell phone is not yet the serious device that they may want to go to when it comes to formal higher ed. Again, very early to say. I'm a big fan of the work that John Sweller has done on the cognitive load theory. The evidence is just so powerful. I'm a big fan of the work that Kirshner and Hendrick have done, and they've written a book now called How Learning Happens, and second version of that is How Teaching Happens, and they've looked at all the seminal articles and all of that related. So what I meant by that was I truly believe learning is learning is learning. And so if that learning is not following what we call it the information processing model, then it's not going to support the learner that that learning content is being created for, be it in-class learning, online learning, micro learning. Now new words are popping up, nano learning, etc., mobile learning, etc. And so learning is learning is learning. By that I mean is that we know that we have a working memory and a long-term memory. Working memory is extremely limited. It's a bottleneck, very, very tiny. We can probably contain 3 to 5 elements. And I think as we are aging, probably that's decreasing. And with the use of cell phones, I used to know so many more phone numbers when I was younger, but I don't anymore. I think I just know my husband's phone number, which is good. So working memory, bottleneck, and unlimited long-term memory. But the content that is being introduced, the new information, new knowledge that is being introduced in a learner's brain has to pass through that bottleneck of working memory. Now, if we're designing, let's say, micro-learning content or any learning content for that matter, if it is not aligned with that notion, that is what I call the human cognitive architecture. It's not my word, it's Sweller has come up with it, perhaps, and it's mentioned in the literature multiple times. The idea of cognitive load theory, the idea of three different kinds of load that we have: the intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. If we're not following all those aspects carefully in designing our learning content, then just by saying that microlearning is good is not enough, because we can create really bad examples of microlearning also that will not reach the learner's mind and the brain, and long-term learning will not take place. So that's what I mean, that just alone microlearning is not enough. It is sort of, if it is sitting on the strong theoretical foundation of cognitive science, cognitive learning, then I think then we can create something that has a lot of value for long-term retention. And that's actually what I meant. And of course, if I wanted to talk about cognitive load theory, it's going to be probably another long session. But just to briefly give an idea, right? This idea of bottleneck takes you to this unlimited, but the bottleneck needs to be respected for any learning to happen. I not only just the videos that I create a lot of micro learning content, and I experiment with different ways of doing it. I may create an infographic that's interactive, that have embedded videos in them, or I will create a video of my own, sometimes just with some footage that's available on the websites, and I can record my voice on it, or I might try some animation, or I may create an infographic and just to see what impact. And again, it depends on your learning objective as well as what the purpose is that you're going to use that content for. What that has done for me is that knowing what I now know about cognitive load theory, and actually having built videos about cognitive load theory. So there's a series that I used chapters from Kirshner's and Hendrick's book called How Learning Happens, and I created a microlearning series called How Learning Happens. And I every now and then add more videos to that series. So there's about 5 or 6 right now. What that has done for me through that process, that it has actually transformed me as an educator also. So I've always been mindful of it as I've been teaching, that, I want my learners to understand what I'm teaching. But creating videos about micro learning, creating videos about cognitive load theory, and creating more micro lessons just puts the learner and how learning happens at so much of forefront for you. So it's something I cannot just ignore. It's right there in front of my eyes. And I'm also really big fan of the Golden Principles by Rosenshine, the 10 Golden Principles of Direct Instruction. And I remind myself, is my lesson going to be aligned with those? So that's what it has done to me, is that every time I create something and I learn from it, I go for a little bit more. And again, going back to the connection of cognitive science and cognitive learning. I think I can answer that actually, again, depending on the cognitive science. And I would say this is how experts are made. So the difference between expert and novice is huge driving force for me, huge sort of support model for me as well. So I think it is crucial to know whichever model you're going with, be it the ADDIE model, or I follow the cognitive load theory, and you're understanding the learning science behind it. I think how learning happens, which is why we teach that over and over and over in our courses at university. Initially, it's a longer journey, but you'll notice that once you do it first time, probably feels like an overkill. It is true, for a 2-minute video, sometimes you might be spending 10 hours if you're lucky, or maybe multiple days, and then you show it to someone and you learn, oh yeah, it worked. And the next time, all of that is probably a little bit more sort of lubricated in your mind, and then you can just jump on it faster. Your decision making becomes faster. So how in cognitive science we say novices, starting with not a lot of prior knowledge, but then as you continue to build that knowledge, it becomes more accessible in your brain. You don't have to constantly go back to your books or your websites to see what you have to do. Similarly, as you're working with a platform, new software, Zoom, I'm sure at the beginning of 2020, everybody's like, where do I do this? How do I share my screen? Now it's become rather normal for many, right? So that difference, I would say, between novices and experts. So to answer exactly that question, I'd say I do think it is necessary to start off with that, to be able to create good quality content. But having the knowledge that I know one day, through the process of this experience, this creation of content and learning, it becomes a little bit more of a second nature. That's why more experienced teachers can go into a classroom and teach without having everything in their hand, because they know what to do. And have more experienced doctors will know how to do certain things and diagnose. So the difference between how novices turn into experts through that process, I think, is how I would like to answer that question. and and not taking a shortcut. That's just because, then we're not going to be creating quality content for our learners. So as I mentioned, my research is at the point of data collection is complete. I am also now quite getting deep into the analysis piece of it and trying to connect dots. And what I'm realizing right now is that this is really an exploratory study, which is this idea that not much has been written about microlearning in academia. So I'm finding out many things for the first time, which is what makes it very exciting as well. But it's also a very scary feeling to be standing alone sometimes. It's like, am I saying the right thing? Am I writing this correctly? Am I figuring this out? But I have an amazing team on my committee. So they're guiding me in such a great way. It's a really great combination of people who understand learning from so many different angles. And there's a cognitive component, there's folks making sure that I stay on track. So where I'm at right now is, as I said, I'm starting to now put things down in writing, and it's like, what does that look like? And uh, just getting quite excited about what I will find. And as I said, it's the implication I feel is that it can contribute to this notion of, again, this role of how we could potentially integrate, or if we want to integrate, or is there even an option, microlearning in formal higher education. So yeah, getting into the writing phase of it, getting into more data analysis. And for folks who've done something like this before, they know it's not a linear process. There's a lot of, like, you do something and they write about it, and then you go back to the beginning and they write. It's a very the only one way I could really explain this to myself is that, really, you're opening up a box of like 1,000-piece puzzle, and you don't really know, but you're just playing around with it, and then you create your little sections, and at the end it all sort of comes together, but you have many patches. This is where I'm at right now, creating my patches.